During a press conference at the White House on Tuesday, on the occasion of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit, Mr. Trump made some very controversial statements about Gaza, saying that the US would take over the Strip, saying that the US would redevelop it, would level destroyed buildings, would turn it into a Riviera of the Middle East. Understandably, these comments have been very controversial, not just in the region, but really across the world. Now, we also know that President Trump has a tendency sometimes to use hyperbole, but he's also a man of action. How seriously should we be taking his statements? And if he is in fact serious about executing this plan, what would the consequences be?
So I think we should take everything Trump says seriously. This is, at the end of the day, the President of the United States saying that the United States would go in, own Gaza, take it over, and decide how the future of this land will be, but it would not include its people, its residents, saying that the people of Gaza have suffered, which is true, and that it's been a hellish place on earth, and therefore they should leave, rather than actually the person responsible in large part for that hellish situation being sitting first and then standing right next to him. So it's important to take it seriously, because the reaction from the world must be to absolutely reject the Palestinians being displaced. Let's not forget, this comes after Mr. Trump several times said that Egypt and Jordan should take in Palestinians, which is frankly the displacement of Palestinians that the extreme right of Israel has been promoting for years. And now they've got a president sitting in the White House that's actually regurgitating what they've been saying in different ways. And so not only should it be taken seriously, the consequences are very dire. This could be the end of the ambitions for the Palestinians to have their country once more. There's always this talk almost that Palestine never existed and now they're going to get it as some sort of reward. No, Palestine did exist. Palestine was there in the 18th and 19th century. And then we've had this terrible eruption of the 20th century, post-Second World War, so to speak, and the end of the British Mandate. And history is important, and you can't just wipe it away. And it was incredible where he's making a statement almost like, why would Palestinians want their own land? And one of the reporters in the room said, because it's their home. It almost like this is a small tidbit that doesn't matter, but actually it is at the heart of what we're talking about. This is a land with a people, and those people have a right to be in their lands.
Are we to then assume that this has been something that Mr. Trump has been planning for a while, or was this something that you think he might have said on a whim?
I don't think it was on a whim, because when he was speaking from the press conference, from the podium, he was reading from a paper. So this does not feel like a whim. Again, the details of it, it could be something that he's blown out of proportion that then will come down. But the idea that the US would take control of land and try to reimagine it in the way he wishes is not new to this administration. Let's not forget that Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, who at the moment doesn't have an official position, but spoke at Harvard at the peak of the Gaza war, saying that you could have great beachfront apartments in Gaza without thinking, well, who actually would own these apartments? It's been really important to see that the reaction globally, importantly from Saudi Arabia, has been immediate and said, we reject this. It is still about a two-state solution. 75% of UN member states recognize a Palestinian state. So all of that is important, and it means something. It can't be taken away just because somebody says something in a press conference. But it's a very worrying precedent, especially because it was said within the presence of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
You mentioned Saudi Arabia. How important or how much weight will Saudi Arabia's position and other Gulf countries' positions carry on whether or not President Trump is actually able to execute this plan?
It's of huge significance. Saudi Arabia particularly, of course, the Gulf states, other Arab countries hugely important. But Saudi Arabia, member of the G20, has the moral authority of having Mecca and Medina. It was Saudi Arabia that first put out the Arab Peace Initiative in the Arab Summit of 2002. That basically was for the first time Saudi Arabia saying we will recognize the presence of Israel, establish ties with Israel not only as the Arab world but as the Muslim world. Later, it was endorsed by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, together saying we'll recognize Israel in return for a two-state solution with Palestine. So they really are the guardians of the Arab Peace Initiative, and for them to say we are still committed to that. And also, President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have made it very clear that the big prize for them is establishment of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So given the importance they also put on that relationship with Saudi Arabia, then it is of major significance that Saudi Arabia was very quick to react overnight in real time. That statement was put out by the foreign ministry in Saudi Arabia, hugely important.
Yeah, it's a non-negotiable issue for them. But it's one thing for the president to kind of announce this plan, and as you said, we should be taking anything that the U.S. president says seriously. But when we talk about practicality, how feasible is this? Are we talking about an exercise of force if the U.S. is really to take over Gaza, as Mr. Trump said?
It would have to be by force. No one's going to welcome them if it wasn't by force. Sometimes people don't connect the dots, and it's important for us as journalists not to forget some of the developments that happen that get us to a certain point. So CENTCOM, Central Command, is the American military's kind of way of figuring out how their command structure works. Israel used to be part of European Command, Europe Command. It was never part of CENTCOM. In January 2021, so 4 years ago, Israel was put as part of CENTCOM as an attachment. CENTCOM and the regional military presence of the US started to get much more concerned with Palestine and Israel. So in a way, in terms of configuration, which is really boring and bureaucratic, but it's already kind of there, you have American bases in Israel and, of course, American troop presence all around. I cannot imagine that the US would send troops and try to hold Palestine, especially since we've seen how many lives that the Israeli army lost trying to actually hold Gaza. So if the Israelis can do it, I can't imagine the Americans would. Also, President Trump has promised his constituency and his voters that he would not start another war in the Middle East. So it completely negates his promise not to be involved in a war. So I don't think he's going to want to go and invade Palestine. But then how do you physically do it?
Right.
And so that becomes a question. Does Israel then feel emboldened, therefore goes and reoccupies Gaza because they've gotten this kind of blessing from the American president?
Right. And you mentioned also Mr. Trump's statements recently about Egypt and Jordan and other neighboring countries, insisting on several occasions that they will take, the masses of Palestinians that he says should leave Gaza in order to, quote unquote, clean it out. What would the consequences of that be for the establishment of a Palestinian state first, but also what would the consequences be for these neighboring countries, especially, we know that these are countries that have very strong ties with the US.
So, first of all, for a Palestinian state, sometimes it has been floated around that you could have a Palestinian state, but not on the historical lands of Palestine. That is rejected by Palestinians first and foremost, but also if you start to reconfigure the Arab world like that and the Middle East like that, there's a lot that could unravel as a consequence. So that's one issue, both morally wrong, but also political consequences. For Egypt, any Egyptian you will speak to, they will say that we fought for Sinai and we're not willing to just give it over and have Palestinians from the Gaza Strip just brought into the Sinai. However, you have heard from extreme right elements in Israel, but also some Americans say, well, they could just take them in the Sinai and there's lots of desert there. And of course, you can't just replace Gaza and Sinai, but that has been spoken about. Egypt rejects that, both politically, but also its people reject that. And then you look at, of course, Jordan, and Jordan has always been under this threat in the last 70 years or more of the possibility of pushing Palestinians out into Jordan, creating this thing called a confederation of Palestine and Jordan. Jordanians reject it, Palestinians reject it, and they're the people that matter. But also it puts huge strain on the political structure in Jordan. And so Jordan's and Egypt's ties with the US could become strained as a consequences. But what will matter is that the rest of the Arab world also makes it very clear that the futures of Egypt and Jordan are very important for this part of the world in terms of stability and what's right and wrong,
right,
and therefore would push back. But I don't think that Jordan or Egypt will ever accept that or could accept it, frankly, politically. And we've already seen, of course, King Abdullah of Jordan and President Sisi speak to one another in the last 12 hours to also reaffirm their position on this issue.
This is all happening at a very sensitive moment the Gaza ceasefire. It's at a very sensitive stage as well. We're at right about the time when there should be discussions about the next stage, which should also include conversations about the governance of Gaza, which is a whole other complicated matter. But what will these latest remarks or this plan proposed by Mr. Trump do for the ceasefire agreement? Do we think that it's at risk of completely falling apart now?
It is at risk, but I don't think it will completely fall apart because, one, I do think President Trump cares about his reputation, and he staked a lot on saying, I was able to get the ceasefire agreement before I was even president, and now want to go into phase two. Egypt and Qatar have put in a lot of effort to make sure that phase two comes through. But it does throw an incredible shadow over negotiations to get the ceasefire agreement to continue if, as a consequence, the Israeli government feels emboldened and feels like, I don't actually have to compromise, and I don't. However, there are still hostages held by Hamas, and the fear is that as a consequence, Hamas thinks, hang on, I'm not going to play ball anymore and give up one of the few cards that they are able to use. And these are humans and these are people, but they are also a political card for Hamas. So do they start getting incentivized not to hand over any more hostages to try to avoid any forced developments by the US and the Israeli government?